You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nutrition Matters podcast. As always, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm excited to dive into this conversation. Today, I'm speaking with Diana Rice, who's a registered dietitian, and she does a lot of great work with families, with pregnant women, and with feeding young kids. And so we're talking about a really interesting topic where we're drawing this analogy between intuitive eating and learning a language. So we're talking about what it's like to have intuitive eating be your native language. Now, many of you will know that it's my strong belief that we're all born intuitive eaters. And so in the end, it really is all of our native language. However, what we're really talking about here is if you can have a strong foundation in intuitive eating through childhood, we're talking about what that looks like, at least in Diana's experience. And kind of contrasting that to what it might look like when dieting is maybe someone's native language around food, and kind of exploring what the differences are there, what the kind of unique addition and equation of her personal upbringing with her personality, with her kind of supportive environment to be able to foster her relationship with food as a child, and how that helped her be resilient when things kind of got a little bit tough for her at various stages of life. So I love the idea of looking at, let's look at like where things can go wrong with food and where things can go wrong with maybe parenting and how we treat our children and how we talk about food. All of that's really valuable. But I also really like the idea of looking at what happens when things go right. And when things go, quote, right, does that need to be perfect? What does that actually look like? What does that mean? So that's sort of what we're exploring here. I really am excited to share this with you. I've thought about this idea of the analogy of intuitive eating and kind of like a language, learning a new language. And Diana and I explore that metaphor throughout. And yeah, this was a really fun episode to record, so I'm excited to share it with you. And thank you so much for being here. As always, just keep in mind, you're welcome to join me over in our Facebook group for the podcast, Nutrition Matters Podcast Community. You're also welcome to check out any of the online courses to see if they might be a fit for you at positive-nutrition.com/academy. All right, with that, let's dive into talking with Diana. Hi, Diana. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast.
Hey, Paige. Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. Well, today I'm excited to dive into some fun stuff with you. Diana and I met up in Salt Lake. How long was that now? Like 2 years ago?
I think it was almost exactly 2 years ago.
Okay, so like 2 years ago we met up and just got to know each other a little bit. You were in town and reached out, and so we've known each other for a little while now and kind of kept in touch, and you came up with this great idea to talk about intuitive eating as as what it's like to have intuitive eating be your native language. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. So I'm super excited to chat with you about it.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited to share.
Cool. So take a minute and just kind of tell people who you are, where you live, kind of some basics about you, and then we'll dive into the talking point.
Great. Yeah, so I'm a registered dietitian. I have my own business called the Baby Steps Dietitian, and I focus mostly on really nutrition in any way that it intersects with pregnancy and infancy and childhood eating. So I do both writing and counseling. I really my focus areas are anything that has to do with getting pregnant, being pregnant, postpartum recovery, and then anything having to do with infant feeding. So breastfeeding, starting solids, toddler feeding, picky eating, preventing picky eating is a big one, and then just helping parents establish a normal relationship with food in their own homes, and hopefully, raise kids who the same as me become native intuitive eaters themselves. Even if a lot of times there's issues that the parents had with food that we need to look at, to see if they're going to translate to the kids and how we can address that, and really just sort of try to get families back to this concept that we all have, which is being able to eat intuitively and trust our bodies and love our bodies, and that's really my passion and my focus.
Awesome. Yeah, and just to frame the conversation a little bit, I want to just make sure that I'm always sensitive that this might be someone's first time listening to the podcast. So for those who aren't familiar with the podcast, we do spend a lot of time here talking about how to develop a healthy relationship with food, we talk about eating disorder recovery, we talk about intuitive eating, we talk about health at every size. If you aren't familiar with those terms, I would encourage you to check out my blog or even Diana's blog. And then there's books about intuitive eating. There's a book called Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. We're also going to be referring to Ellen Satter today. She's done a lot of incredible work in regards to child feeding and healthy families. And, we talk a lot about intuitive eating from the angle of how do you work toward this if you've been a chronic dieter, or if you have struggled with an eating disorder, or if your relationship with food feels out of whack. And so how this conversation is going to be a little bit different is we also want to look at intuitive eating from the angle of what does it look like when your native language is intuitive eating. That's not to say that someone who doesn't have intuitive eating as their native language, so to speak, or their kind of natural approach to food, that's not to say that you're wrong or bad or there's something wrong with you. It's just to look at this same stuff from a different angle. And again, like you've already mentioned, Diana, your passion, and definitely one of my passions as well, is to be talking more about preventative things that we can do for eating disorders, for disordered eating and chronic dieting. And one of the big ways I see us being able to make an impact in the next generation is to really talk about how do we raise the next generation with a healthy relationship with food. So this all kind of fits in to that picture. Would you add anything else?
No, I think that that's perfect. I mean, I think what's really interesting to me is that in listening to your podcast, and I should say that your podcast, since it's been around for a while now, was one of the first ways that I don't want to say got introduced to intuitive eating, but really started to see what the impact, in all the personal stories that you share, the impact that this has on people's lives when they are recovering from dieting and becoming intuitive eaters. And I didn't even realize that intuitive eating was my native language until hearing all the stories that you share on your podcast and on other podcasts like it, and other places, where we talk about rejecting dieting and embracing intuitive eating. I just, it really just deepened my passion for working with families, so that there become more stories like mine, because I feel like we hear those stories of dieting recovery so often, and it's so great to share those, and it can be really empowering and cathartic. But I think it's going to be really cool to start sharing stories like this, and maybe share stories of families that are able to preserve intuitive eating in their families, because that's really what you and I and other professionals in the intuitive eating space are all working towards.
That's such a great point. And I like the word you used was preserve intuitive eating, which
Um,
is a really good kind of thing to talk about for a second. So the idea of intuitive eating is that we're all born knowing how to be intuitive eaters, or just basically just knowing how to eat. We're born knowing when we're hungry and when we're done. Now, obviously there are exceptions to this, so don't take this too
right.
literally, but in general, we know when it's time to eat, we know when it's time to stop, we know how to communicate those needs. Hopefully those needs get met. And, as children grow up, they start to sort of lose that connection with their innate cues and with their satisfaction and with their sense of pleasure with food. And kids and teenagers and young adults tend to sort of move more toward how can I manipulate food or use food to control my body or my feelings or whatever it is that's going on in life. And obviously, that's not every person's story, but that's sort of the typical narrative that we hear, especially maybe on this podcast and others like it. So when we talk about preserving intuitive eating, the idea is we already know how to do this, and parents can play such a powerful role in helping to maintain that innate wisdom within their children through kind of learning more about this approach to food and eating and feeding their kids.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the more conscious you are of this at the get-go, that's why I really love to work with parents who are starting solids, because, I can inform them of, best practices and things to watch out for, before anything goes off track. So that's, I'm really passionate about that. But of course, I think you can sort of jump on this train at any time throughout
Yeah.
parenthood.
Yes, you can. And that's another really good point is no matter where anyone is in parenthood or even in their own journey, um, this can become kind of like learning a second language too, right? Where you can be
Yeah.
fluent and you can do great with it and you can communicate. But anyway, it might be a little bit harder, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong
Right.
with you if that is your story.
Right.
Okay, well, hopefully we did a little bit of background there. Just I always like to think of maybe some questions people might have or concerns they might have, but really the main one here is it's okay if this isn't your native language. This is just another angle to look at this. And like you said, I totally agree. I hope there's more stories like yours in the coming years and generations because it's so cool to think about a child growing up, even in this world that's pretty diety. It's cool to think about how you can grow up and have intuitive eating be your native language.
I absolutely agree.
Cool. So, Diana, tell us about kind of just some general sense of what it was like to grow up in a household where intuitive eating was sort of the norm.
Yeah, so I mean, like I touched on a little bit, I didn't even realize that there was anything special about my story until, just a couple of years ago, honestly. I became a dietitian as a career changer. So, even throughout my first go at college, I wasn't really conscious of these issues, like, the issues with diet culture, so it all felt really normal to me growing up. But now that I know more about the best practices and I'm able to reflect on my own experience, I can recognize and be really grateful to the circumstances, that, influenced my childhood. Basically, I have three younger siblings. I'm sure we were all a handful to feed and keep track of. But food was never an issue in our home. And that's something I talk to parents a lot about is that food is neutral, right? Whether it's ice cream or whole wheat bread, it's just food, right? And so growing up, food was there. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a food secure home, and I was never pressured to eat. We had a mix of, healthy stuff and treats. Probably not even the healthiest now that I think about it. I mean, this was, in the late 80s, early 90s when, frozen dinners and, canned soup and stuff were pretty much the norm. But I don't think I was a picky eater. I don't think any of my siblings were. We would have family dinners every single night. I look forward to that so much, even, throughout high school. I didn't even know that having issues with food was basically a thing that could happen. Now, I should mention that a lot of these circumstances I later found out were very intentionally designed, mostly by my mom, who herself grew up in a household where her own mom was always dieting. She was pressured to control her food intake because of her body size. She continued to struggle with dieting throughout my childhood, but she never once, like seriously, never once expressed any dissatisfaction with her own body in front of me or my siblings, and never commented on her own food intake. So because she was dieting, she often wouldn't be eating the same food as us, but she probably would say, "Oh, I ate while I was cooking," or something like that. So I didn't even realize that she was dieting probably until I got much older. And
you know what I like about that? Really quick, I'm just going to jump
yeah.
in. I like people to hear who might be parents. I like them to be able to hear that you don't have to be quote unquote perfect as a parent with this stuff for your kids to really benefit from, kind of at a minimum, really trying to not talk negatively about your body in front of them, right? So like even just
Right.
that can be such a positive thing. Meanwhile, maybe your mom was dieting and was going through a lot with that, or had a lot of baggage from her childhood, but just the fact that she didn't blast herself was huge for you. And maybe obviously
Yeah.
combined with your personality type and all the other causes and conditions in your own life. I just like people to be able to hear, like, your mom wasn't quote unquote the perfect intuitive eater, right?
Right. No, she was still working on it. And, she's made a lot of progress in her own life, on that issue now. But, this is what I tell the women I work with is, this is going to be a journey. This could take several years, but it doesn't mean that it's a kind of like if you were having financial troubles, right? You wouldn't the kids wouldn't necessarily know about it, right? It's kind of a grown up thing that stays in a grown up space for a little while. And, really the core principles of, not, expressing your body dissatisfaction in front of your kids, and certainly not commenting on their bodies or what they're eating. We actually have a lot of research that supports that, children who have grown up in households where, either the parents are expressing body dissatisfaction or aren't, is a huge contributor to how they feel about their own bodies and their likelihood to diet as adults. It has a huge influence. And I don't know if any of that research was out, back when I was growing up, but I think my mom knew it intuitively, and she was going to do all she could to sort of protect us from the experience that she'd had, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So take home message, you don't have to be perfect. And like you said already, like you can, there's no like lost cause element to this. You can do better even if you have made body comments or you have,
Yeah.
and all of it towards the right direction, are good moves to make.
Right.
Cool. So then so you mentioned that you didn't really have any awareness of like body image or food stuff being an issue until you were into college, right?
Yeah. Now, I do want to mention here that I was in a small body, just genetically speaking, I guess. So I don't know what my experience would have been if if I had been in a larger body as a kid. I know that my parents still would have done their best to, not comment on it and not restrict my food intake. But there, of course, are, factors of what you see in magazines, on TV, So I don't know if I might have internalized, some of the dieting mentality if I had just been in another situation. But as it was,
Sure.
I honestly, yeah, and I also want to kind of throw in that of course, I knew about dieting and I knew about, some of the health issues that supposedly are connected to being in a larger body. Certainly we've done a lot of research now about whether or not that's actually the case. But even now, it's pretty normal to think, like, oh, you're in a larger body, you need to lose weight in order to be healthy. Like, that's not necessarily true, but a lot of people frame it that way, and it felt pretty normal to me to have that perspective growing up. So when I finally did realize that my mom was dieting, I still didn't really realize that it was because of any body image issues. I thought she just wanted to be healthier. So it was kind of strange to me to get to college and start socializing with a lot more young women my age who were also in smaller bodies as I was, who still were restricting their food intake and making comments about, what their bodies look like, negative comments. It was honestly like kind of a head scratcher to me. I was like, I don't get it. You look a lot like I do. And I don't have any body image at the time. I didn't have any body image issues. So it was kind of an awakening for me, but it still didn't affect me that much. If anything, I kind of thought it was a bummer. I would want to go to the dining hall with my girlfriends, and they would say, like, like the first time they said they had to study instead of going to dinner, I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then, as it became more of a trend, I was like, oh, they're trying to avoid going to dinner here, which I thought was a bummer because I wanted to, I had such a wonderful experience with family meals growing up. And I kind of was lucky to preserve that in college. And I just thought it was a bummer when people around me didn't want to eat or didn't want to go out for ice cream, things like that. But I did, I definitely sort of became more conscious of that kind of thing, probably during my college years.
Okay. So how did that take shape? Sounds like you were aware of it. Did you yourself struggle, or were you just kind of like, that's for them, not for me?
It just didn't even cross my mind. I think I was still coming from the place of dieting is only if you are, trying to get into a smaller body, which I already was, So it still didn't cross my mind to do it, until actually right after I graduated college. I studied journalism in my first go at college, and it was pretty tough to find a job in media in New York City where I was living at the time. So I graduated and I didn't have a job, and my job prospects weren't that great. And, it was kind of just a hard time in my life where I was no longer living in college dorms and having that community. And I don't know how I got the idea, but at some point, I guess probably because I didn't have any money, I was like, I decided to restrict my food intake, not as a means of changing my body, but as just a way of exerting some control over my life. Like, I can't control who's going to give me a job. I can't control how much money I have, but I can control, how much I eat. And I guess I had probably picked that up from some of my peers in college. I did that for, I think, 2 days. And then somebody offered to buy me dinner, and it crossed my mind that I wasn't going to know exactly how many calories were in the dinner. And I was like, yeah, sounds good. Let's do that. and I forgot I never went back to it. I forgot all about it, honestly, until I became more, attuned into the issues with disordered eating and why people go down those roads. And it was probably 10 years that I didn't even think about that experience until I realized, what if I hadn't had the resilience to drop that? What if I had developed some full-blown disordered eating, during the sort of hard times that came my way after college? And it just makes me all the more thankful for the confidence and resilience that my upbringing, instilled in me, to not do that. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but it just seemed more important to me to enjoy this great meal that somebody offered to buy me than to keep at it.
Yeah, and I love that you've already said this, but I just want to reiterate the idea of, this being your native language is a really positive result from your particular personality, your particular genetics, your upbringing, also your sense of like who you are and what you value. I mean, that ability to just be like, oh yeah, I'd way rather connect with you than count calories, so who cares, I'll go out. That's really, it says a lot about who you are and your family and your upbringing, but also like you just kind of got lucky in a lot of ways there too, don't you think? Plus the fact that you were in a smaller body, so there's that privilege that you've already talked about. But just I want to reiterate, like there's that does tend to make it maybe easier for some versus others.
Absolutely, yeah, and I can't discredit, the lucky factors that went into all this. But I really like what you said about, it coming back to what I value, which is huge, and is also something that I talk to parents about all the time. If we're talking about my experience right after college, I wasn't sitting down and making a list of my values, right?
Yeah.
But just sort of subconsciously, I knew I'd rather enjoy some delicious food. I'd rather spend time, with, going out to dinner, going back to what I was saying about, even spending time in the dining hall with my friends, all of those things were more valuable to me than, potentially losing a couple of pounds due to restricting my food, or even the control that limiting my food intake might have granted me in my life. And that's, I think that ultimately that, valuing food in that way is what led me to change careers and become a dietitian. Because, I just think, I was thinking, what I wanted to add some focus to my writing, and I was just thinking what I most like to write about and what I most like to do. And I was like, I like to cook, I like to eat, I like to share family meals, and that's what ultimately led me down the path of becoming a dietitian, which I'm also really grateful for, because I know a lot of people become dietitians either because they were able to heal from their own disordered eating stories and they want to do the same, or perhaps they even had some disordered eating when they were choosing to study nutrition, and they thought, maybe studying nutrition would, give them all the facts they need to have the most perfect diet or something like that. And again, that wasn't the case in my situation. It was really just this passion that I try to, instill in the families that I work with, is that, food is great. Food is so wonderful, and it's a force that brings us together.
Yeah, definitely. So, did you feel like an outsider in school? Is one of my questions, given the fact that maybe it was that it was the second career for you. But also, I'm also interested to hear about what it was like to kind of be coming from that like really positive, happy space with food, and maybe noticing classmates, or once you became a dietitian, colleagues like kind of have different experiences than you.
Yeah, I gotta say, as I started to study dietetics, I still was not especially informed of all of the issues in dieting, and I still probably held it in my head that that dieting was appropriate for people who need to improve their health. And I feel like I'm kind of ashamed to admit that now, but I also feel like you can't really blame someone for starting out with that perspective, because that is what our culture constructs. So I think I got into it thinking, I'm going to teach people how to eat healthy and enjoy family meals. And my experience in school was pretty typical in learning, this is how much protein you need. This is how to calculate, somebody's calorie needs. And after I became a dietitian and really started connecting more with people like you, in listening to the stories on your podcast and other, digging into the research on health at every size and the non-diet approach, that, I kind of realized that how this all tied in with my background and, how I, wanted to, use that approach in my own work. Because it feels to me like the best approach, the approach that leads to the least harm. And that's really important.
Yeah, I so agree. So, okay, so we're using this analogy of a language very purposefully here because I think it works really well. Where you're saying, yes, you were still exposed to like diet culture, of course, because you were, raised just, in diet culture. So of course you were exposed to it. But the fact that this was your native language, it was very easy to kind of come back to this as what you kind of felt comfortable with and already knew. What's tricky is a lot of people, their native language is dieting, right? They like learn dieting as their native language in the home or so young or so intensely in their life that that is their comfort zone as they go back to that. So when you're learning a new language, or even when you're trying to teach a language that you already know. So English is a good example. I have a 6-year-old and she asks me how to spell stuff all the time. And I'm like, yeah, this one doesn't follow that rule. And she's like, well, why? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know why it just doesn't. And maybe spelling's a bad example with English because it's so confusing. But there's also things like sentence structure and grammar and all kinds of elements of language that it's hard to even explain why, but you just could say to someone learning English, you could say, no, that sentence is right. I don't know why, it just is. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious about your experience of like realizing that intuitive eating was your native language, but also kind of having to circle back and figure out, okay, how do I teach this language to others who may have had dieting as their native language?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about that, that analogy crossed my mind as well. My brother is a English as a foreign language teacher, and he had to go get certified to do that. It wasn't enough to just teach English, to speak English in the first place, right? Like you have to go learn how to be the teacher of English, even when you already speak English. So my experience was that after I became a dietitian and I started hearing people like you talking about intuitive eating in this book, Intuitive Eating, like, oh, I better read this book. And I picked up a copy, and what's really interesting is that it actually took me a long time to get through the book because the first couple of chapters are talking to the dieter. And I was like, this book's not for me. Everything she's talking about, I pretty much already know. That is not at all to discredit their amazing work. So eventually I was like, okay, everybody's talking about this book. I really got to read this book. And I did. And I, realized with like the 10 steps, or the principles, how much work Evelyn and Elise had done in going back and putting into a teaching practice the things that people like me do intuitively, and then adding on top of that what you need to do to actually push away dieting as the old language and reincorporate intuitive eating as the new language. So I do think that it's one of those things. It's like it should be. I would love in 50 years, 100 years that we're all speaking intuitive eating, intuitively as we're speaking whatever language we grow up with. But, it's pretty clear in our culture that, we need instructors, right? like you and me, or just being able to pick up a copy of that book and read it, to really recognize, because we're going to eat every day, right? Figuring out, as in the work that you do all the time, how to make those decisions and how to, I know that for people who are currently in the dieting mentality, it can seem so difficult to implement all of this, right? But as you go along, and it might take a couple months, it might take a couple years, like it is possible to achieve it in the same way that, if I had to learn Russian or something, like, oh my gosh, I'd be like, where do I even start? I don't understand any of this. But we know that it's possible to learn any foreign language when you put the dedication into it. And I think it's the same with intuitive eating.
Yeah. And I mean, the analogy is just so good, because I'm also thinking about, like, how do people really learn another language really, really well? I mean, you can spend 5 years in school learning a foreign language, and you're in class, an hour every day learning it, but then you speak your native language at home and with your friends, and you don't practice it a bunch, but you do, an hour 5 days a week, let's say. Okay, you're going to learn that language a lot slower than,
yeah.
If you go to that country and you live there among people and you have hardly any opportunity to speak your native language and you just immerse yourself in it, you're going to learn that a lot faster. And then you also think about, what is it like to learn a foreign language at age 50 versus at age 3?
Yeah.
And just the ability for your brain to be able to learn that new language, it's going to take a lot less time when you're younger. So because you have a lot less experience with language in general, a lot less sort of preconceived notions about how to pronounce things and what sentence structure looks like and all the ins and outs of language. So I think it's such a good analogy, because for anyone who's listening, if you're feeling frustrated, like, wow, why is this taking me so long to figure out intuitive eating, or to try to put these things into practice, or to even wrap my head around these concepts? What is wrong with me? You have to ask yourself a lot of these same questions, like, are you immersed in it as much as possible? And the answer is probably no, because culturally we're immersed in the language of dieting, right?
Right. And it really takes that. I remember taking language classes in school and kind of just coasting through them because, it was a requirement for my degree or something like that. And, it's definitely not the same as compared to, finding a study buddy and speaking that language, over a coffee date or something like that, and really going above and beyond to really commit to it. But that's the thing with intuitive eating, right? It's like, you can't come at it thinking that it's another diet, it's going to help you lose weight. You can't come at it thinking, you're just going to do it maybe for dinner, but not breakfast and lunch or something like that,
Right. And so this idea of immersing yourself in it is kind of tricky because of the culture we live in. You can set boundaries and you can do the best you can, but that's tricky. So it's not like you're going to go, to that foreign country and just immerse yourself into the language. You have to kind of think about your journey with intuitive eating, kind of like you're sitting in class, as often as possible, and you're really trying to work on it. And maybe you're going above and beyond and having a study buddy, so to speak, like maybe a friend you can go out with, or a spouse, partner, or, neighbor, whoever, to kind of practice these skills with. But it's going to be slow going. You're not immersed. Chances are really good that you're not immersed in this, because it's just impossible. So then if you think about, how does one learn another language, it's being in it as much as you can, and practicing it, and even trying to do it when it's not required, maybe people tune into podcasts, or they go and meet with dietitians or therapists once a week or whatever, but just really looking at your life like you would be looking at it with a language. If you really want to learn it, you're going to have to expect it to take a long time, A, and B, you're going to have to really try to expose yourself to it as much as possible, and C, continually practice it.
Right. And I love how that extends to raising intuitive eaters, right? Because I'm not lucky enough to be a dual language family myself, but if I were, I would have whoever among me and my husband who spoke another language. I would definitely have one of us speaking that language to the kids all the time so that they would learn it too. But that's what we're doing in raising our family. I have two young girls, raising them hopefully to be intuitive eaters is just by creating that culture in our home. And we never talk about good or bad foods. We never pressure them to eat. My husband and I, eat everything in front of them. When we go out for ice cream, you better believe I'm eating it too in front of them because I want them to see that. And we talk about how yummy it is. We also talk about how yummy broccoli is,
Right.
So I think, for people who may be still struggling with becoming intuitive eaters themselves, but who have kids and who are wondering, how can they even start to make sure that their kids don't go down this road, is exactly that. It's like making your home the environment where, your kids are immersed in this. And fortunately, I'm just thinking about really young kids. My kids are 1 and 3. Our home environment is really the only environment that they know. And so I get to influence that quite a bit, and hopefully develop in them the resilience so that when they become older and they're both girls. So I know that they're going to be exposed to a lot of the, stuff about diet culture that affects women, that they have the resilience and the support to not go down those roads. And I really think that, beyond the way you talk about, food and eating in your home, when your kids know that they are loved and supported, unconditionally, I think that really helps them to not feel like they need to change their bodies in order to earn that love. And so that's a huge part of what we're trying to do in my home right now, and what I hope other families can work towards as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to say that while this is preventative, this is doing everything we can as parents and as the older generation raising up the younger generation, it's also not a surefire way to guarantee that issues won't be, formulated in our little children. So the idea of, yes, it's very beneficial and positive for families, for parents to not talk negatively about their bodies in front of their kids, let's just say, or even better yet, not talk negatively about their bodies at all. We also really want to be careful to not ever make it sound like you're guaranteed to avoid eating disorders with that type of environment, and or if you did say those types of things with your children, that you are to blame if they've developed struggles, right? It's such a
that's
tricky
a great point too. I think it's very similar to we know that getting 5 servings of vegetables a day or something like that is might reduce whatever cancer risk by X amount, but it's never going to be a sure thing, and we do the best we can with what we have, and hopefully don't stress out too much about it as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that eating disorders or even struggles with food in general, like these are very complex conditions, and so it's never anyone's fault. However, let's do all we can to acquire the education and the knowledge to be able to do the best we can to help prevent them in our families, in our communities, in our younger generation, and even in every generation, right?
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully we'll see those numbers going down as the generations progress.
I hope so too. My goodness. So so we've kind of, in your story, we've gone up to college, and then you've also told us that you have 2 little girls. So talk about kind of going from college to switching careers to kind of your current day stuff. Like, how has everything morphed as far as this theme of your native language being intuitive eating?
So it's actually, now that I'm more conscious of what the issues are, it has been even more helpful to me to recognize intuitive eating as my native language. So basically, I probably, I was in a pretty small body in college. I gained a little bit of weight over the next couple of years, but I would always be like, oh, I guess I have to buy another pant size. I wonder if I should diet, because that's what my friends were doing, and maybe I would try it for like an afternoon or something. And I actually just thought that I was like, I didn't have the willpower for it, but now I recognize that I just had other priorities, and I was more resilient to resist it. But it did actually affect me quite a bit after my first pregnancy. When the baby weight didn't magically fall off like I had just assumed that it would. I was exclusively breastfeeding. We had this concept that breastfeeding makes the weight melt off. I found myself a couple months postpartum and in a very different body than before I had gotten pregnant. And I wasn't sure what to do. Like I felt like maybe I'd done something wrong in terms of my food intake. But at the same time, I wasn't going to diet. This was probably just, when I was just starting to learn about the issues with dieting. And so, basically I would go along every day being like, gosh, I wish I didn't still look pregnant. I was pretty dissatisfied with my body. But it was just basically a wish. Like, I didn't change my food intake really at all. I knew the importance of eating to satisfy my hunger, especially while breastfeeding. That's something that I talk to women about a lot. And so I think that this resilience and being able to continue to be an intuitive eater, even though I was starting to have body image issues, became especially valuable to me at the time. Another pregnancy in, honestly, my body it has changed, and it looks like it's going to stay that way. And I've been able to, become more comfortable with it and accept it. And I think that that's especially valuable, with two little girls in the house. I'm not just not commenting on it. Like I genuinely am comfortable with it, even though it doesn't look like it used to, and even though it doesn't fit the societal norms.
So you've used this word resilience a lot. I'd love to hear, what do you attribute that to? I know we've already talked about kind of the way you were raised and that sort of native language, but what about, is there anything you can kind of break down for anyone listening who's like, ooh, I wish I could be resilient in the face of that. How does she do that?
Yeah, I think honestly, it goes back to what we were talking about values and priorities. I think all along, I have been able, from my upbringing until now, I've been able to understand that my physical body is not, the most valuable thing about me. I mean, this is even, just talking about like, what I wear and whether I wear makeup and stuff, whether I have a fashionable haircut. Like I definitely, wear makeup and buy clothes that I hope are flattering on me. But it's just not the most important thing about me. And I think that comes, that goes back to my upbringing in learning, that I had value just simply as a person, and that I was loved unconditionally, this, I mean, my daughter loves the show Daniel Tiger, and there's, I think that there are a lot of adult lessons to be extracted.
Oh yeah, Daniel Tiger's the best.
Yeah, and it all comes from Mr. Rogers, and we were watching the one the other day. That's you are special. It's not the clothes you wear or the things you do. I like you just for being you.
That's really all we want. All anyone wants.
True. Yeah, so just I think that when I think about what has made me resilient, it is knowing that it doesn't really matter what my body looks like. The other things about me are much more valuable.
And that intellectually, but it seems like that on like a really kind of like soul level.
I think so, and I think it just all goes back to my upbringing. I also, if this is relevant, I was raised Christian. I'm still Christian. So, I think about, being a child of God, and our bodies are really just temporary, right? So, so that is another thing that I fall back on.
So this sense of like it doesn't really matter because there's more to me than the way I look or the way my body looks. I am so much more than that. It's it's somehow you've had this ability to not only see that intellectually, which I think a lot of people can, but also to feel it on that deeper level, I think is sometimes a big journey for people. But I personally think that anyone can get there. I think we can do it. But there's sometimes more messiness and kind of like a web to kind of trace and follow down to the core for some people to figure out who might not have been raised in an ideal situation for developing that sense of what
Yeah, I mean,
matters, you know?
I don't, we're not really talking about food and body image issues anymore. I mean, we're just talking about what makes a secure childhood and upbringing. And, it's sad but true, there's plenty of people in the world who, because, that their own parents were imperfect and they bring those issues into adulthood and they may or may not instill them into their kids. And there's therapists who are doing great work in that space. But it's just another cultural issue, honestly, that only compounds our issues with dieting and body image.
Well, and it's also a helpful thing for people to recognize, like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. If I look at the way I was raised, or if I look at the messages I got as a child, I can see why I have this core belief that my body is the most important thing about me, or I can see how I've developed this sense of I need to manipulate my body in order to be loved. Like, I think that I'm hoping that the conversation we've had today can help shed light on sort of a more like a causes and conditions approach to why you might be in the place you are with your body image or with food. A lot of times just this very simple sentence of like, "Oh, I get that. That makes sense. I can see why I struggle, or I can see why I did that, or I can see why this happened for me." I just think that's such a helpful and compassionate way to approach it rather than I'm so bad, there's something so wrong with me, I'm terrible, I can never do anything right, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, realizing, first of all, I'm certainly not a perfect parent myself. I don't think my own parents would call themselves perfect. We all are doing the best we can, right? And I think that it's important for adults to realize that our own parents are doing the best that they could. And, we may have issues regardless, because we're all just, walking around Earth just as imperfect beings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, talk about how all of the stuff that we've talked about today kind of translates into the work that you do. I know you've mentioned that a lot along the way, but is there anything you'd like to mention?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that we're going to talk a little bit about Ellen Satter's work, and absolutely, I am like a soldier of Ellen Satter. Every consult that I do, I'm talking about her work and the principles of the division of responsibility, which I know you've covered on the podcast in the past, but it's essentially that the parent is responsible for what food is served, when it is served, and where, and the child is responsible for whether and how much. And what is kind of emerging in the work that I do, and I didn't necessarily get into it for this reason, but I'm finding, parents are the work I do in particular with families starting solids. Parents are so concerned about their kids eating enough, getting enough protein, but on the flip side, if the child is a great eater, then they're concerned that the kid is eating too much. And, so much of it that we bring to the table, is not necessarily, like we've been saying, children are born with intuitive skills. They need to be intuitive eaters if we can stay out of it. A lot of the work that I do is not really addressing the child's food needs, but the issues that the parents are bringing to the table in feeding the kids, and how can we, just like you were saying, like, oh, I can see why I do that, going back to something that they might have grown up with, and hopefully, moving into different habits that are going to shape, the whole family, and their eating perspectives. I do this even, if I'm working with a client for preconception nutrition. They don't even have kids yet, and I think that's especially exciting because I can work with the couple to get to a place in their eating habits and their family meals, so that if and when the kid arrives, they can sort of be born into this environment. So, I guess you'd say it's like a holistic approach. I'm not a very woo woo person in general, but I don't see, when I'm working with any individual, I know that they're part of a family unit, and I know that their family unit is going to influence their eating decisions. So I feel like I'm working with the whole family, even when I'm just working with an individual.
Yeah. So it's interesting what you're saying. It's making me think about the work that I do. I primarily work with adults, and I will have people ask about feeding their children, or even sometimes I have people that I'm working with just for the purpose of like a picky eater or a particular feeding dynamic in their household. And yeah, 9 times out of 10, it's all right, let's talk about you as the parent and your approach to food and what your beliefs are and what's going on with you, how you were raised and how you're approaching things with your child and why. And then typically things can kind of come together. Um, kids often, more often than not, just don't need any fixing. They just need support with their food. They need love and encouragement and neutrality and gentleness with the whole eating situation, rather than rules and pressure and all of that. But a lot of times that those rules and pressure come from parents wanting to do things right, quote unquote, and parents being worried about too much or too little, or yeah, you're right, just kind of overcomplicating this very sort of innate intuitive skill that children are born with. So, it's even though I don't feel like I work directly with children, and a lot of dietitians who do this work don't work directly with children anyway, but I see it as sort of we're all doing our part to help prevent these issues. If even just a 20-year-old who's listening, who's in college, let's just say, is listening to this, hopefully they can bring this knowledge into their communities, into their friend circles, and eventually maybe into their own families. Yeah, and I see this work no matter what phase we're working with. It's all doing really cool things for the future.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny that you say that. I sort of set out to primarily work with kids, and then I realized that I was going to have to work with adults in
Yeah,
order to sort of set the kids up for sort of the best eating experience.
yeah, totally. Well, cool. Is there anything else that you would want to say to kind of tie things up or summarize or conclude?
Well, I mean, just speaking of, the families that I work with, I often, see, slightly more complicated issues, whether it's like a kid who needs to go on like a gluten-free, or casein-free, diet. And, people don't come to me when they've got just like normal run-of-the-mill stuff going on. And I recently had my own experience where my younger daughter onset food allergies. She's allergic to peanut and tree nuts, and that really it really kind of shook me, but it helped me sort of get into the headspace of my clients. And it was a strange experience for me because we had to eliminate things from our home, and I've never actually eliminated stuff from my diet before, and suddenly I was in the situation of like, what do I eat now? I used to eat, protein bar with nuts in it or something, and I can't eat that anymore. So that was, a pretty emotional experience for me. Just, food allergies in general are really scary. I don't like the idea at all that, like I was saying, I love food. I celebrate food. I don't like the idea that food could hurt my kid. Um, and it meant a lot of changes in my home, but ultimately I think that is I would give it back. I wouldn't I would trade it back for anything, but I do think that it has made me a better practitioner because I'm able to, sort of get into the heads of my clients who, are facing some kind of specific issue with food, including allergies. And one thing that I'm doing right now is I started a Facebook group for allergy parents. There's a lot of Facebook groups already out there for allergy parents, but what I noticed is that it's about managing your kids' allergies, but it's also about taking care of yourself when you are an allergy parent, because there's so much to worry about. So my group is called Self-Care for Allergy Parents, because there's a lot of resources out there already about how to manage the kids' issues specifically. And of course, I definitely recommend consulting with a registered dietitian for expert advice. But what I want to get at is addressing the mom's needs and basically emotional well-being, so that she is well cared for, and she's in a good place to provide for her families. And I don't know why. I mean, obviously dads are in the mix as well, but my work mostly focuses on women, so I'm doing self-care for allergy moms, and just hoping as we've been talking about all along, to help people get to a place where they're comfortable with these things, and are doing the best they can.
Good. That sounds so awesome. And just personal experience with some family and some friends who are the parents of children with allergies. I know that's so needed. It's stressful. It's so hard. I also just wanted to say, like, this whole conversation we've had about intuitive eating as a native language, some of my listeners will be like, oh yeah, that's my dad, or oh, that's my best friend who's such a natural intuitive eater. So what I want to say is, maybe I'm hoping that this episode could be helpful to sort of be understanding of those in your life who might be innate natural intuitive eaters, and who might have the inability to understand your own struggles with, or just like the kind of like the idea of how do you teach English when you just know how to speak it. You don't think about it, you just know it, and you just do it, and you don't really know how to explain why you know it, you just do. I think that helps to develop some compassion for others in our lives who might be really, maybe it might feel very insensitive or rude at times, what they might say, or just like they don't understand you or they don't get you. Maybe just understanding it from that perspective, I'm hoping could be helpful, and vice versa. If you're listening to this and you recognize, oh, I'm one of those people who this is my native language, and maybe understanding why these issues are so much easier for you than maybe someone else in your life who you can recognize this isn't their native language. I'm just hoping this can help us all understand each other a little bit better.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, I think another good point is for the listeners out there who might have a story like mine. Like we've been saying, you still have to learn how to be the teacher. So, maybe recognizing that it's not like, well, I just eat what I feel like eating for lunch. Why don't you do that? To the person who is recovering from dieting, it's not going to be that simple, and kind of, recognizing all of the work that person is putting into the process, because they're learning a new language, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. Will you just take a quick minute and tell people how to find you?
Yeah, my website is dianakrice.com. As I mentioned, I go by the Baby Steps Dietitian. Most of my social media is Diana K. Rice, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest. My Facebook page is Baby Steps RD, and that's where you would also find a link to my Facebook group for allergy parents.
Yay. Awesome. Well, I'll post links to all of that. And thank you so much, Diana, for joining me. It's been great to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me.